Corsets. They're everywhere. And whether you buy into Hollywood and the media's representation of corsets as antiquated means of patriarchal oppression, you want to try to make one. But where do you start? Don't worry, I've got you. And if you want to learn more about the history of the corsets, check out my channel. I study corsets on my PhD and I have a lot to say. Corsets are actually one of the main reasons I started sewing. A Victorian hourglass corset was one of my first few sewing projects. And yes, it was ambitious. If you also want to jump into the deep end, I'm here to tell you the most straightforward 10 steps to making a corset. This corset. Now, a disclaimer. This isn't a full in-depth tutorial into every aspect of corset making. Corset making is an art, a learned craft that can take years to master. But if you have a pattern and you just want to get started, I'm going to give you a roadmap of a path to take. One of many options, as there is no right and only way of making a corset. You can then look up some more in-depth tutorials for specific skills. For example, I have other videos where I show in more detail how to put in a corset busk or how to make binding. This is just an overview of all the steps so that you can easily conceptualize the roadmap to making a corset and following instructions if you have them. If you want to go a step further, then I highly recommend Vaniani's corset making course. This is not sponsored, I just know Luana at Vaniani's and she has given me access to the course and an affiliate code, where if you use it, you are directly sponsoring someone else's bursary access to the course. So I don't get anything, you're just helping someone else along. Luana is an incredible teacher and will walk you through all the details, all the fundamental skills to make as many corsets as you like. Please check out the link in the description box. For today's example, we'll be using the Vaniani's Aran underbust corset pattern. This is a modern corset pattern which stops at the underbust. I wanted to try this as it was the pattern featured in the course and it seemed like a great everyday option to practice my corset fitting and making skills. But you can also get it outside the course. This pattern has a total of 6 panels per side and produces a shapely hourglass silhouette with an allotted 2-inch gap at the back. The gap is important. It ensures that you can lace your corset well and distribute the pressure evenly. It also helps if your body tends to fluctuate, so you can lace it tighter or looser as needed. For example, today I've laced it tighter than usual, so my gap is a little bit smaller than 2 inches. For my materials, I will be making a 2-layer corset. Now, in a very brief overview of materials, for a corset you have a lot of options. The most common is either a single layer corset, where there is 1 layer of fabric, or a multiple layer corset, where there can be several layers of fabric. The most important thing is that you use a strength layer, whether it's in multiple layers corset or the only layer. A strength layer means a fabric that is tightly woven with no stretch. Couture is a fabric developed in the 19th century with a herringbone weave. It's very strong, but also lightweight and thin. However, it can be hard to find and expensive, so a strong twill with little give is a good option too. You can test this by pulling on a scrap of your fabric and seeing if it stretches or gives at all. You can also use a fashion or outer fabric, a pretty layer as I like to call it, and I will today. You can also add a lining, which I'll be skipping today. My fabrics for this corset are 1 meter of cotton couture and 1 meter of cotton sateen as the pretty fabric. These were from my stash. You will also need a busk, eyelets, and your preferred boning. I'll be using my 2 favorites, synthetic whalebone and flat steel boning. I only use flat steel at the center back of the corset, but this is personal preference. I prefer whalebone as it molds well to the body and it is very lightweight. Step 1, mocking up. With materials out of the way, let's start making. The first step is mocking up. This is a crucial step. Crucial! You must test your pattern by cutting it out of scrap fabric first and making a mock version. Ensure your fabric is also strong or it won't mimic the final corset well. A good option are twills or sturdy cotton canvas. The Aran pattern was a wonderful fit. It needed very little adjustments. I sent a video to Luana who helped me make some brief changes to the pattern, particularly lowering the underbust line and adding a little more room at the lower ribs. Once you've made the needed changes to your pattern and you're happy with the fit, we can move on to cutting. Step 2. Cutting. Cutting fabric is a tricky but important skill. Crucially, you must align your pattern pieces with the grain of the fabric as needed. Most patterns have this as an arrow or other marking. The straight grain of the fabric is the strongest direction, but some patterns might have you cut a piece off grain so that it wraps around the body. This pattern does. Either way, ensure you have aligned it correctly. I do this with a ruler from the selvage edge. Cut as precisely as you can. A rotary cutter is often my most precise tool for the job. Don't forget to cut the panels from all of your fabric layers, including seam allowance. If your pattern doesn't come with a seam allowance, you'll have to add it. Step 3. Flatlining. If your corset only has a single layer, you won't need this step. For multiple fabric layers, it is common to baste layers together to then be treated as one. I do this to my couture in pretty fabric by laying the corresponding panel pieces wrong sides facing each other, and basting with a large running stitch or tack across the edges. I also work from the top down and from the middle of the panel outwards. This can take a while. I've been much more successful with smooth pieces when doing this by hand rather than by machine. There is also a technique called roll pinning, but that is a little bit more advanced, and I would recommend only looking it up once you've got flatlining down. Step 4. Inserting the busk. I prefer to insert the busk before the front panels are attached to the rest of the corset, as it's much easier to maneuver. If you've got a single layer corset, you will need a facing piece for your front panel, as the busk is always sandwiched in between 2 layers of fabric. First, I ascertain that yes, the loop side will be on the right side of the body and the stud on the left. I forget every time. I then ensure I have the right corresponding pieces and pin the fabric and the facing together along the center front. The left or stud side will be sewn as a normal seam. For the right or loop side, I line up the busk with the edges and mark where the loops will need to go, leaving a gap in those sections when I'm stitching. Then the loop side slides in as the loops align with that gap. I also line up the stud side to match the loop side and mark where I need to perforate the fabric with an awl to then shimmy the studs through. I top stitch around the busk with a zipper foot, and that is it for this very brief and quick busk insertion. Step 5. Seaming. Then it's time to do all of the seams. I'm doing what I consider to be the simplest seaming method, one where the seams are automatically finished by the application of boning channels over the raw edges. Therefore, all seams are sewn with the wrong sides facing each other, putting the seams on the outside or right side of the corset. I press them all neatly. Don't worry, I know it looks messy, but it will work out. But you can also do this with the seams on the inside. You'll just have to put the boning channels on the inside. I prefer to put them outside. Step 6. Stitching boning channels. The boning channels can really be anything you like, as long as they are sturdy or the bones can eventually wear through them. Good options are densely woven twill or herringbone tape. For mine, I decided to do this with matching bias binding, as I would need this for the corset edges anyway. My binding is equivalent to the width of 2 bones plus 3 or 4 millimeters, so I can top stitch along the edges. I positioned them over the seams by marking the middle of the binding, putting a pin through it and ensuring the pin comes through the middle of the seam. I then pin horizontally across the tape, the whole length of the seam. I first top stitch along that middle line, then about 1 or 2 millimeters inwards from the folded edge of the tape. And voila! 2 boning channels, 1 covered and finished seam. Then you just have to do this for every seam, or everywhere that you want a boning channel. Step 7. Boning. The boning you use can be down to your personal preference. The most common are synthetic whalebone, flat steel and spiral steel. Synthetic whalebone is thin plastic that behaves similarly to whalebone. It is lightweight and flexible. Flat steel is strong, inflexible, and comes in many widths and thicknesses. Spiral steel constitutes of many interwoven steel spirals, which creates flexible and strong boning. However, I find it to be quite chunky and heavy. For my corsets, I nearly always use synthetic whalebone with 1 or 2 lengths of side steel at the center back, and sometimes over the sides, a very typical Victorian thing to do. For my boning, I cut it all to be approximately 3/4 of an inch shorter than the top and bottom edges. This ensures that when the corset is bound, you won't be sewing over the boning. For my synthetic whalebone, I use a nail file, or you can use a Dremel, which I also prefer, to file down the edges until it is smooth and round, to avoid poking through the binding. For the steel, I typically cover the sharp edges in zinc or thick sticky tape. This isn't the best practice, but it works for me. Then I insert the boning channels into their corresponding place. To keep in place where I finish the rest of the corset, I sew a machine basting stitch across the top and bottom edges within the binding of the seam allowance so that it will be hidden once it's bound. Step 8. Binding. Your binding can be a myriad of things: ribbon, tape, bias binding, but again, it should be strong. You want something that will curve along the edges if your pattern is curvy, and something strong that will prevent the boning from wearing through. The basting stitch I did earlier also prevents the boning from wearing through. I'm using matching bias binding, which I made from my pretty fabric. I leave 1 or 2 inches of binding over the edge, which is actually how they historically did it in Victorian factories. This means we can finish the corners by hand with a few whip stitches. I pin the binding to the top and bottom edges of the corset, right sides together, and stitch. Then I press away from the corset, over the raw edge, and to the wrong side, folding the other raw edge of the tape under, like this. Then I hand stitch in place with a whip stitch. If you're very confident in your machine sewing, you can also top stitch or stitch in a ditch to keep it in place. I just like to sneak in a bit of hand sewing whenever I can. Step 9. Eyeletting. For the eyelets, I transfer the markings with chalk or a pencil, and then I use a 2-part eyelet and an eyelet press. The eyelet press is just because I do so many of these, but most eyelet kits come with a way to install them. Either a little plier or one of those little punch things. Prim eyelets are typically very good. I prefer 4mm eyelets as I think they look the most pleasing and fit neatly between the channels. I first cut all my markings. You can use an awl if you don't have any way to cut it. And then I just insert all of the eyelets. Step 10. Trimming. Now for the fun bit. Most historical corsets have some type of decoration. Trim or lace across the top or bottom edge. Maybe even some corset flossing. For this corset, I decided to add a simple strip of white lace across the top. But trimming is where you can let your creativity soar free. Just keep in mind the purpose of the corset. If it's a fashion piece that will be visible, then you can add 1,000 things. However, if it's in an everyday piece that you're going to wear something over, keep in mind that any lumps or bumps that may be visible through outer clothing. I position my lace and then I just hand sew it in place. 19th century corsets often have machine sewn lace on top, but this is tricky to do over steel bones, so I recommend hand sewing. And that is it. Those are the 10 essential and brief steps to making a corset, an overview of the roadmap that should lead you to a successful corset. Here is mine. Now go forth and make dozens, hundreds of corsets, and leave any questions down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon.